Good morning, everyone. My name is Simon Gentry. I'm one of the partners here at Newgate Communications. You're very welcome. Thank you to our three guests here this morning. And our first view from the bridge for 2018. Please note there's a hashtag. You're very welcome to tweet away. A short introduction to our three speakers. Gina Miller is a transparency campaigner and philanthropist who, as you know, is very well known for her activity around the Brexit discussion in the country. She is a co-founder of SEM Private, which is now SEM Direct, with her husband Alan, and indeed has campaigned on mis-selling of financial service products. She has involved in quite a lot around the Brexit debates, as we'll hear, I'm sure. And McElvoy is a British journalist, works for Economist, and indeed Radio 4. And again, strong opinions, well made. George Buckley is Nomura's chief economist, and hopefully will help us understand a little bit about the strange situation when we have political instability, but a great deal of economic confidence, apparently. I'm going to ask the three to make a few introductory comments, and then we'll go to questions and answers. When we move to that stage, if you'd like to introduce yourself and the company you work for. Gina, would you like to lead off?
Yes, morning. Thank you very much, George. Year of living dangerously. I thought I would touch on three areas. First, legal. Second, the industry, financial services. And thirdly, some political thoughts. From a legal perspective, I thought I'd just give you an overview of where we are. Because in this whole scenario of Brexit and beyond, none of us are futurologists. So I think we just have to look at what is going on at the moment, the processes involved, and where the possible outcomes are. Now, from a legal perspective, there has been a huge flurry of activity in the courts. At this moment in time, there is a Scottish case, I'll call it, which is seeking referral for a judicial review in the ECJ on whether Article 50 is revocable. My own personal view is it's not the best use of time and money, because I think it's unanimous that it is. So I didn't particularly think that was such an important case, but it has received referral status. Secondly, there is a Welsh case who are claiming that because Article 50, the referendum was advisory, and the Article 50 bill, an act that was passed, never actually stated a sentence, the advisory decision is now on our statute books as a legal one. They are claiming that the whole thing is invalid and illegal. So that case, as far as I'm aware, has gone through, is about to, we'll hear in the next week or so, whether they will get referral to be heard in Wales or London. Thirdly, there is, for us to leave, if we are to leave without a deal and leave the EEA, we need to trigger something called Article 127, which you have to do 12 months before we leave, so it would have to be triggered, and that would require an Act of Parliament in March of this year. On a legal footing there, a case was brought against the government last year, but they were told by the courts it was too early. Not that you can't bring the case, but go away and come back when the time is appropriate, which would be March or April of this year if the government did not put through that statute. Then another case, there are quite a few coming up, which you might have read of yesterday, that was filed in Amsterdam, looking at, do EU citizens' rights derive from our membership of the EU, or does it derive from the fact that you are actually part now of a treaty and that those rights can't be taken away? Now, the importance of that case is that if that case were to succeed in the ECJ, that would give every British person right of freedom of movement. It's a significant case. And as far as it was reported yesterday, it looks as though they will get right of referral to the ECJ. And then there's a case that I'm quite interested in, but we haven't filed anything. There are two areas that I'm interested in. One is, and there is very divided opinion in the academic world and the legal world on this, so it would have to be decided in a court of law, is to whether another say by the public is actually legally required, which will be interesting as we go through this process this year. And finally, on the back of my case, that if you think about it, the Article 50 Act, with the issuing of the letter, shot a bullet. But until we go through the negotiated process and we know exactly what rights are going to be lost, that bullet hits its target, we won't know what rights are lost and which will be kept. And in that case, there needs to be another act of Parliament, not the withdrawal bill. So legally, there is a lot that needs to happen in 2018 and 2019, and actually beyond. Then I get to the Article 50, the withdrawal bill. It's an interesting one, the withdrawal bill, because actually it doesn't have that much to do with Brexit. And you might be curious as to why. I find it very curious as to how silent the official opposition are being on this, either with abstaining or just really not picking up details in this bill which are increasing the power of the government. Now, there's some interesting articles by Lord Judge, who says that if this bill goes through, unamended or largely unamended, it will increase the powers of the government to, for example, decide where evidence might be required in a bill, or in a crime. They could change the burden. They will have the powers to change legal requirements on different crimes, on contract. It would give them a huge sway of power. That's actually the essence that everyone's very worried about. The Hansard Society have also written about this on the withdrawal bill. Now, my view is that, cynical view, is that perhaps the opposition being particularly quiet on this because they can smell power. And why wouldn't they want a far freer increase of power if they are to be in power? And to me, that fills me with horror. The idea of a Corbyn government with more power and less scrutiny is something I think that we should be worried about. But I think that's why they're being so quiet. And then on to some of you here from the city and our view here. As we all know, the curse at the moment is MiFID II. You may have seen some press on our views recently. We are looking at an audit process at the moment, doing a research of companies and how compliant they are, on particular on Article 24, which is on fees and charges. And at this moment in time, I think we found one company that's compliant. And that's across platforms, advisors. We cannot find, and some of this fault, we believe, sits with the FCA, because there are two things missing from that article. It never specified, and actually MiFID itself didn't specify its form or format. It did not specify a formula that companies would have to use when coming up with that total cost of investing number. And also it didn't specify where it should be. In our view, we think it should be on the fact sheets or on websites, because that's where most people use. But at this moment in time, we're very concerned that MiFID will not be complied with. And you must remember that the fine that goes with MiFID, if a company is not compliant, is 10% of turnover. So maybe it's time to think for companies to be very concerned about what will happen if the FCA or even ESMA decides that these fines have to be brought on board. And I think 2018, from a directive point of view, there is a lot to be worried about. GDPR, when that comes in May 25th, the fines there are 2%, or I think it's 2 or 4% of turnover, up to 4, I think it is, up to 20 billion euros. That will completely change the model of a lot of businesses. If you consider at the moment, you've got businesses that might have a mortgage part of their business, an asset management. Will they be able to share data anymore? It looks as though they won't be able to cross-sell. It will be significant, the changes under that. And the regulator for GDPR has said categorically, there is no bedding in period. From the 26th of May, they will start fining companies. And then you have the shareholder directive, there's PRIPS. There's a lot of work to be done around the directives this year and next year. And those who say, oh, well, we would have left, so it doesn't really matter, and I hear that quite regularly and very worryingly, this idea that the UK companies will just be able to plug and play in Europe is not that simple. Because if we have to have full alignment, if we have to have full equivalence, we will have to have all of those directives in place we will not be able to diverge come the 30th of March or onwards, or whenever it is we leave. And then lastly, a few words politically. This could be a very interesting year. Phase 2 will dictate the direction and the framework of what we leave with. And we have April to October to do that. Because the transition period is transitioning to wherever it is we've decided we are going to. And at this moment in time, it looks like Canada and not much else, which again, we could spend all day talking about, I'm sure we'll get into. But what if the deal comes back and the government are defeated and there is a constitutional crisis in October and we go to a general election? And at this moment in time, I am surprised that Labour is not much further ahead, but they're not. And say Labour were to win and it's a minority government and they have to form an alliance with, who would they form that alliance with? Would Lib Dems get enough seats, to 10, 12 seats for them to form an alliance? Would it be Sturgeon? I mean, it's going to be a very interesting time if that were to happen. And I think that is the biggest threat, to my mind, the biggest threat of this year is if this government were to fall and there's a constitutional crisis. Thank you.
Anne.
What a good point to pick up on. Thank you very much, Gina, for that. I'm going to just do a very a quick sort of round the world tour in a few minutes, but I will start with the UK government because there's a very good good handover there. We've been training on this baton team for quite a time together. Actually, if we'd had the baton, we'd be going different directions, wouldn't we? UK government is perhaps not the most prepossessing entity. It is riven with dissatisfactions and rivalries. It has a prime minister in place, probably more by dint of being, the one person that people can agree can carry it forward into phase 2 of Brexit talks rather than overall enthusiasm. But that doesn't matter. The fact is, it is a more stable entity in the first at least 6 months of this year than it was in the last 6 of 2017. Why is that? Well, largely because I think that both sides on the Brexit argument have kind of fought each other to a standstill, and they realise that they need, at least for the near future, to focus on round 2 of the deal, and that their reputations, both in their own party, any leadership hopes that maybe in the wings, hang together with that. That is the single reason why you find people being very quiet. It's when Boris Johnson is talking about girls' education rather than Brexit, you know that something is up. There is going to be a deal, I think, of some sort this year. I don't think we'll be in no-deal territory. Like Gina, I think you will have to be very sort of careful about predicting exactly what it is. I think we're into something called, Canada plus something, minus something else, and you can square that. I don't think we are into Norway territory. I've just come back to talking to at an event with the government in Norway. I think one of the main reasons why not is that the Norwegian government doesn't terribly want to share the limelight on EOS, as they call it, on EFTA or an EEA deal. I think that's very regrettable, by the way, is the course, and I'm less fierce than Gina in my views on Brexit, but it would be the course that I would like to see us go down. However, we must at some point allow reality to bite, and I do agree with Gina, it will do so between April and by latest October. Let's talk a moment about the opposition. I think there's a very great reason why the opposition will not press for an election this year. It simply isn't ready to fight it, and it would lose it. And one of the things that we've seen with the consolidation of Jeremy Corbyn's power this week in terms of the NEC, the Labour ruling body, for those of you who don't delight yourselves by looking into the sort of guts of what Momentum is doing all the time, is really about consolidation of control in the Labour Party. With that in his pocket, in Jeremy Corbyn's pocket and John McDonnell's, they can go forward and forge a kind of election offer that they believe they want to forge, and it will downgrade the role of MPs. But I think that is not possible to do this year. I think it's highly undesirable, doesn't matter what I think. It is not something that they feel able to foist on MPs, and that's why they're going at it in this crab-like way. And if you go through constituency Labour politics, you see it again and again as a sort of pressure on those, both on the only MPs, but often also on constituency chairmen and the like. So I think that what Labour is doing is quite strategically aiming for that. I'm not sure that that's the reason, Gina, why they haven't got their act together on the withdrawal bill. I think Corbyn is at the moment not acting. Parliament is not his main field of play. I don't even think they're thinking in those terms. I think they're thinking about control of Labour. And frankly, they are also getting much better at responding in the moment to pratfalls that involve the government. You saw the response on Carilli, and I have to say I thought that the quick Labour response was rather more impressive than the government's defence. And that brings us to something that I think is going to be crucial in this year, is how do, if you like, more mainstream, more moderate, mixed economy politicians, policymakers defend models like PFI, public-private mix. This will, I'm sure, involve the back end, a lot of people in this room who have businesses that interface with that. It's an argument that needs to be made because the opposition is not coming under much pressure. It's absolutely fine to say you quite like a nationalised railway if it turns out a bit like German railways in 2017. It would not have been a very good argument to make when German railways were in a mess 10 years ago, and it certainly wouldn't be a great argument to make if you had ASLEF running it. So I think we need to see a lot more pressure coming on opposition positions too. Let's just go, if we could, a bit more broadly, because I'm sure we're going to come back to the Brexit word, the wretched Brexit word. But let's talk about the bigger trends. I'm just picking out two: Trumpism versus Macronism. It's interesting that we now talk about Macronism in 2018, perhaps more than Merkelism. I cover Germany a lot. I've made a lot of documentaries there in the last year. I feel that we are in the late phase of Angela Merkel. And what is happening now is really that the two ideas that are being tested against each other are one which is clearly the sort of Trump worldview. You could probably describe that for yourselves in colourful terms, but in the end is a more protectionist, a more inward-looking view in which your advantage economically is at the disadvantage of someone else. And that sort of fundamental defence of open borders, free trade, albeit with a slightly French spin, that being Macronism. Trump going to Davos, by the way, who is turning up next Friday, and as usual with Donald Trump, with maximum inconvenience on the day when most people are going skiing. And this, as you know, for those of us at Davos, is, a lot of us are in therapy actually about it. But there is a reason why, I'm not suggesting he chose Friday afternoon for that reason, but there is something about his consistent ability to disrupt expectations, which you can expect to continue. He may indeed, however, have driven North Korea and South Korea to actually talk to each other for the first time in about 20 years. So perhaps that is one beneficial sideline. The reason he's going to Davos is because Xi last year positioned himself as the defender of free trade, and I think slightly speciously of the international order when we look at how China often somehow manages to dodge the rules. But that is the reason. There is no way that Trump would have turned up in 2017. He can't quite bear the thought that the Chinese are currently carrying that halo at the World Economic Forum. Let's see how that pans out. Russia, I think this will be the year when Russia tries to use the World Cup to establish its gains in the frozen conflict in Ukraine and Crimea. Interesting politically, of course, because it comes straight after a presidential election. No one else can win that election except Putin. But the terms on which it's won, the mood in the country, and particularly, this sort of nascent opposition around Navalny, the only real person of note who was sticking his head above the parapet and has taken great personal risk to do so, will be interesting. The great worry, I've just been in Russia and talking to people I knew there in the apparatus from my time in the 90s. It's amazing how many of them are still consolidated around Putin, is that the World Cup is not enthusiastic enough. So I think we will see a great attempt, a massive propaganda attempt put behind that. And in the background is, if you come, if you play, if you cover this, you are kind of accepting the situation as it is on the ground in Ukraine. The West is going to have to think carefully about its security response to that. And I think that's one reason. If you ask where the head of the armed forces is a lot these days, you will find him in the Baltic states and Finland. I'm just going to touch on something I think is so important. I just don't want it to go, go under the table as we go by country, and that's the big corporate theme of the year. I think will be Genderquake. I'm sure you've all got in your diaries that the remake of Mary Poppins is coming up later this year. If you hated the original as much as I did, do be consoled that it has the marvellous Emily Blunt in it this time. But I think one of the things that we'll see there is the respinning of that film, which always had actually a very pro-suffragette message, if we remember why Mrs. Banks was so stressed. It was because she had to be a suffragette and somehow run a well-staffed Edwardian home. But I think the spin on it will be that feminism, practical workplace feminism and the role of women really matters. We were just talking about it, Simon, on the way in. I think for companies, the focus on boards and almost being able to sort of claim that you have some women on boards will not be good enough. You're going to come under a lot more pressure. People are going to see more pressure, both as the BBC has discovered in the Gracie whirlwind, to be much more transparent about gender pay. But I think we'll also see a lot more pressure on the pipeline of women as well as board level appointments. Tell that to anybody who doesn't want to listen, because I think it is really sitting there. And by the way, I also include media companies in that description. The final figure I'm pointing to is Angela Merkel. As I said, it's a late phase Merkel, but how she handles it matters immensely to Brexit. I think we will see, as she struggles to keep that coalition together, the grand coalition reluctantly forged in Berlin, Merkel needs to take charge again on the European stage alongside Macron, yes, partly to help bail him out of his financial hole, but also for all the crocodile tears in Brussels and Berlin, Brexit does affect them too. I don't think that Chancellor Merkel wants to prepare to lead the stage with this sort of perpetual bad mood that we're seeing between Berlin and London, and that would be something I will be advocating for warming up as the months go ahead into 2018.
Thank you very much. George.
Great. Well, I'm going to sort of keep my remarks more to economics. I obviously cover economics at Nomura, so I'm going to sort of stick with that theme, but obviously dip into a number of those issues as well. And Nomura, we're relatively optimistic, as I think most people are, about global economic output. We're expecting even upside surprises relative to consensus expectations. That's how optimistic we are for 2018. One of the reasons for this is that we've seen a broad-based increase in capital spending across the globe. Capital orders are growing at probably 10% in some of the key economies, though not the UK for obvious reasons. Brexit is clearly having an impact on the willingness of companies to spend. There's also rapid destocking. That's usually a sign of strong growth as well. Clearly, capital exporters are going to benefit substantially from this, the likes of Germany, Europe generally, countries like Korea, for example, South Korea. But there are a lot of risks. One of the key risks that we're focusing on is what might happen to core inflation. I think everyone is expecting core inflation to start picking up. And then the question is, how do central banks respond to that rise in core inflation? Is there a risk of over-tightening? Well, why might core inflation rise? Well, I think one of the reasons is that slack is getting a lot less in the global economy. Look at the labour market, look at capacity utilisation, things like output gaps. Survey evidence on things like delivery times and backlogs are all suggesting that slack is much more limited. Why might inflation not rise? Well, certainly that's been the evidence we've seen recently. You might have looked at the inflation numbers in the UK yesterday and seen that they were still relatively high. RPI actually rose. The rate of inflation on RPI rose to over 4%. But none of that is really domestically generated. A lot of it is due to the fall in the currency. And while you get currency traders who think that the currency looks strong at the moment because they're looking at it on such a short-term view, have a look at over the last couple of years and we're still 17.5% down on a trade-weighted basis, so it is exceptionally weak. But one of the reasons which was talked about by NPC member Tenreiro earlier this week is that she talked about the possibility that productivity could improve. And if productivity improves, then for any given rate of wages, you're going to get weaker unit labour costs. And that's obviously encouraging for not having to pull the trigger on rates and QE right now for some central banks. But still, we have the Fed raising 3 times this year. We have the Bank of England raising twice this year, if we're right. The only economy where really we're seeing, only big economy where we're seeing the central bank continue to loosen is going to be the Bank of Japan. I say only, it's going to have a huge impact on world markets because the amount of loosening they're still doing is huge. The second risk, I think, is the potential for financial imbalances. The bond bubble could burst, for example. Households and firms have become accustomed over the past few years to borrowing at ridiculously low interest rates, which simply cannot be sustained. Debt levels are very high, particularly in the private sector of some countries. I think we need to be very worried about in the developed markets, countries like Canada, Japan, Norway, Switzerland. These countries have quite a bit of stress. And finally, you have China. That's another big risk factor. So far, the deleveraging and rebalancing has happened in a relatively orderly fashion. But that doesn't mean to say that it will do continuously. And we think that we're going to see a slowdown in growth in China, largely because of deleveraging, largely because of a cooling in the property market. That's likely to push growth down. But Asia generally is in a bit of a sweet spot at the moment, I think, particularly some of the I say smaller than China, which is pretty much everywhere else. India, Indonesia and Philippines, these economies are still doing very well, both structural and cyclical recoveries. Finally, onto the UK, very briefly. Can we continue to see an improvement in growth in the UK? Now, obviously, growth has slowed relative to the G7. If you look at the average rate of the G7 or the range of G7 growth rates and look where the UK is, 2 years ago, before the Brexit referendum, we were at the top of that range, as we had been for 5 years. We are now at the very bottom of that range alongside Italy, around about 1.5% GDP growth. But there are reasons to be optimistic. The last 2 cycles were substantially longer and involved a much greater increase in output than we have right now. The global recovery is great for the UK economy. We are a highly open economy. Our exports plus imports as a percentage of GDP, the openness ratio as economists call it, is about 60%. That is double what it is in the US. So we're in a prime position to benefit from this. Austerity, not just in the UK, but everywhere, all across the major economies, has been toned down quite substantially. We saw that in the budget of last year. We saw it in the autumn statement of 2016. We're going to see rising wages in real terms over the course of 2018 as the impact of sterling on inflation falls out and nominal wages start to rise because of the labour market tightness. I'll end on the risks, which is probably a bad way to end. I should have thought about this when I considered what to say. Brexit uncertainty is one of the key ones. FX could fall further if we see the Brexit negotiations, as David Davis said, be concluded at the 59th minute of the 11th hour. This is not good for things like business investment, for sterling. That will obviously have an impact on consumer spending. Rising inflation could prompt more rate hikes than we expect, which the Bank of England could do too much. Weak productivity globally is a key issue which all politicians need to focus on, and of course there's that risk, the risk which is always in the background of financial instability, particularly when you have interest rates which are so low, which people have become accustomed to and have borrowed far too much on account of.
Very good. Thanks very much. An opportunity now to ask some questions. While you think of some good questions, I'm going to ask, one of the things that struck me doing the job that I do is I expected business to be very, very active lobbying around Brexit and the kind of deal we got. And the first surprise I got was actually in Berlin, where a bunch of companies said, actually, we've been asked by the government, we're not going to get involved. I should say that a large aerospace company then quietly came to me and said, no, we're very, very active. But I do wonder why you three think we haven't seen a much stronger, I mean, you do see the CBI and others occasionally opining, but where are the large German, French, Italian companies in this? Are they doing this in the quiet, or are they entirely absent, allowing the politicians to do what they want? Gina?
From what I hear, they are actually active, but in the background, because they've realised that everything to do with Brexit is so toxic that for them as a business, there's too much risk associated with them being visibly involved. But they have been very active. What has surprised me is how inactive the city has been, actually, from our point of view, and the joined up thinking for the different organisations actually pushing for a very imaginative deal, because unfortunately I think that we probably don't have enough time. But if we had done this last year, I think we could have really pushed and gotten, and got the other countries, because this is now about damage limitation, the EU is going to miss us hugely. And it's not just our business, it's our lawyers, our consultants, our civil servants. You know, we are very active and very valued in the EU. But behind the scenes in Brussels, Nordic countries, the EEA countries, they have been very active. They've been trying to push, and I absolutely agree with Anne. Unfortunately, Norway, the EFTA countries do not want us in there to rock the boat, so that's not going to be an option, I don't think.
I do think there is push going on in the background. It's also not really the style of, particularly I think, French and German countries to put themselves out on the line. I mean, I suppose, well, you know, depending how strongly you feel about what needs to be said, you just say British companies actually, you know, at least we kind of, roughly speaking, know what they want. I think we knew what the city wanted, and if it couldn't get passporting, it wanted something as near as damn it, and probably is going to get it. So I'm not sure that, you know, that in Britain that companies have made much of a mistake. I think, you know, we can't be too polite about this. The other reason is they got a bloody nose in the referendum campaign. I mean, they all wanted to stay, and 52% of people wanted to go, and eventually, you know, they do wake up to this. So they don't really know quite how to put their message. I think it would also, frankly, be wrong for those who, you know, probably should have thought more carefully about how they phrased their arguments on the referendum, to say, do you know what, you were all, you know, we didn't convince you last time, so now let me tell you, you know, exactly what to do. So I think there is a balance in what business should do there. The one thing I would say is, I mean, if I, you know, were advising companies, I'd say I would focus on the transition period. You cannot control exactly what the deal is, but what I hear most, and you know, I'm sure the views on the panel might not diverge on this, is that sometimes people don't mind so much what they get, but they do want to know. So now you mentioned Brexit uncertainty, and I certainly found that when you go to China, where there's less focus perhaps on, was it Canada double plus negative squared, or is it something else, or is it EFTA? But they just want to know when they can sort of get on with planning investment. And that is where I think that this sort of, sometimes the noises off from the government have been very unhelpful. What Philip Hammond really needs to do is to focus on exactly how long a transition period businesses can expect. He can say we need wriggle room after that to do this negotiation, but I think if we had more clarity on that, so, you know, it would calm perhaps some nerves in business around the world.
George?
Yes, and just to pick up on that point about the transition period, I mean, it's not for another 3 years until we're going to experience proper de facto Brexit. Of course, de jure Brexit is going to happen earlier, but we're not going to be out in terms of the impact on companies for longer than that. I think, and Gina is in a much better place to talk about this than I am, but I think a great off-the-shelf idea for a transition period, at least, I don't think it can be used any longer, is the EEA. We're in it. It would stop all of this debate about how a transition deal should look. We could save 6 months, possibly. Obviously, it's not an ideal situation for longer than that, but still. I think a lot of companies also simply acknowledge the fact that they are not going to get something for nothing. The European Union is not simply going to allow us to leave and then we can then choose precisely what we would want from the European Union afterwards. And finally, there's a lot of companies who have benefited and are benefiting from the fall in sterling. And of course, that's encouraging at the moment. So they've got 3 years of in the EU and in a transition deal, plus the fact that sterling is helping support competitiveness for their exports. Before Christmas, I think it was on the 22nd of December, the ONS revised their forecast or revised their actual numbers for exports of real goods and services. Instead of rising by 4% over the last couple of years, they've risen by almost double that, by 8%. So you can see that exports have benefited substantially. The UK is now at the top of the G7 in terms of performance on exports.
Very good. Some questions, please.
George Casso from Tullow. I'm curious, you mentioned Trump a wee bit, but actually not that much, and which is a surprise, I suppose, if you think a year previously. So I had 2 questions. First of all, some ideas on career. I mean, obviously you talked about the fact that the careers have been pushed together, so some thoughts on where that might go to. But also, is his tax reform, is that a game changer? Does that help him in the midterms this year and also into the next general election as well?
Career, I think. I mean, it's always disturbing when this sort of level of security politics is conducted by tweet. However, I do think that there is a policy here. I'm not sure it's been written by Donald Trump. In fact, I'm probably relieved if it's not been written. I think if you look to the sort of McMaster, particularly to H.R. McMaster, and to that sort of that sense that those people around Trump who have, it's very interesting if you look at the Michael Wolff book, how that machinery just seems to sort of chug along while Steve Bannon's fallen out of a window and Donald's gone to bed with a cheeseburger and he's tweeting about, you know, his nuclear button. So I think that there is a hardening of position on Korea. I think it would have come anyway, by the way. I think if North Korea, if we'd had a continuation of Democrat government, because this is really a 20-year problem which has landed on the doorstep of a particularly erratic president, which is why I think you're absolutely right to highlight it. I noticed that next week the summit with Canada it has been basically pulled forward. The risk, I think, for North America, and I suppose you could say for the NATO allies coming in behind that, is that the action moves to a purely North Korea, South Korea theatre. And whereas, you know, obviously anyone would take South Korea over North Korea any day of the week, it is not clear then how that plays into a wider security architecture. It's not clear how much power that gives to China behind the scenes. So I think what is very important is that NATO sort of comes together, not, I think, with a view to blundering at all into anything close to a nuclear button, but we do need a more aligned position on North Korea, and it doesn't really matter, you know, whether one likes or doesn't like the rhetoric of the president. The problem is North Korea more than it is President Trump. I think you're absolutely right to talk about tax reform. It's not particularly good tax reform in that it spreads the benefits clearly, I think, in the direction of upper earners, which seems a sort of jolly funny way for a populist president to do it, but that's Donald Trump for you. It was, of course, a fantastic sort of stimulus measure in terms of the US economy. So if you put aside all the, you know, an awful lot of crocodile tears get cried about Donald Trump, while a lot of people are looking forward to making money. And Wall Street, which started out with a kind of operating manual of being very down on the Trump administration, is, I think, you know, looking for happy days. The slight caveat to that is, I think when you pit Main Street against Wall Street, you deepen a division that is there in American society to start with. And that, I don't really see a ready way around that. I still think, by the way, the Democrats will probably do well in midterms, and I do think they still have more chance of taking back the House.
But on a short-term basis, the stimulus effect of giving companies back money, and you're seeing them giving ex gratia payments to employees, you're probably looking at employment rising in particular belts of the US geographically, that may well play very well in the Electoral College in 2020. I mean, my view is that it makes a Donald Trump second term much more likely than you could have imagined even 6 months ago.
If I was going to say, if it wasn't 9 o'clock, when you and I must go for a drink, talk about this, I marginally, but I do think you're right that he comes into it with probably with a fair economic win. The problem for Democrats, or indeed for never-Trumpers and the Republicans, is they're going to have to explain why, if he's such a dreadful president, the economy is doing so well. I think you're right about that, but I would not underestimate what will happen when the power balance shifts on the Hill, because people talk about impingement. I think that's windy. I think it's like talking about another referendum. It's like, you know, it's so far in the future, or it won't happen. Why don't you focus on what is more likely to happen, is that his dealings with Russia are going to come under a lot more spotlight if we see that balance change in what are effectively midterms. So yes, I think you're right. The economy will be, if you like, the air under his wings. But this is still a presidency that is skating on very, very thin ice when it comes to how it came to power, and particularly on its dealings with Russia. And I think you will see a lot of pressure there. The question is also, someone said to me, on the Trump team, what does Donald think winning is? And if Donald thinks that winning is getting out in time, that is what he will do. Sorry, I should have maybe passed that over to George on the economic side.
No, I wouldn't say. All I'd say is that I think the tax move is probably worth about 0.5% of GDP, which is pretty good. The US economy would have done pretty well anyway, and as you know, on the front page of The Economist this week, talking about the whole point about the fact that the global recovery cannot be pinned to Donald Trump. However much he'd like to say it's his doing, it's not. It would have happened anyway.
Hi, Cindy Goblin from Alex Partners. I wanted to pick up on the Genderquake conversation and also to get Gina your views on it. I was quite dismayed last year to read something from the FT, which basically said it would take 100 years to close the gender gap. But I'm pleased to hear you think, and that the conversation is going to continue this year. And so my question is really around the millennial generation and what you think that we could do as companies to harness the energy and the interest in philanthropy and community of that generation to progress the conversation around women and diversity generally.
It's a lot to say this year. I think the energy this year on Genderquake is going to be significant, not least because of the 100-year anniversary of the suffragettes. But there is a move that outing companies and ending permissive behaviours in companies is going to be a theme this year, I think. That it's not just about data, it's not just about publishing your data in your companies. That won't change. It's the cultures that have allowed this inequality to happen. And I have to say, I don't like focusing on just gender, because I think if we just focus on external diversity, we're not really hitting that diversity button. It's got to be internal mindset, socioeconomic groups, education, because there are an awful lot of women, I'm getting into a lot of trouble of saying this, but there are a lot of women who are held out as shining examples of successes of diversity who've actually gone to the same universities and the same schools and are actually the men in skirts as far as I'm concerned, and we haven't really achieved diversity from that point of view. So I think this year is going to be significant because it will be stopping those permissiveness. The small things stop, and then you don't get the build-up, and it's not, go down the road if you don't like it in this company. So I think that will change. I think there's also an acceptance that some of the projects that have been out there to promote equality, such as the 30% Club, didn't actually achieve because, 30% NEDs is not the same as having them on a board. So it's rethinking what that means, and it's not a simple issue because the pipeline matters more than anything else at the top. And when you have cultures that are not attracting women because they get into an organization, they realize that they hit middle management, that actually they do not want to be here because of the culture of the organizations, they will leave. So you can't promote women if they're not there in the first place. So there is cultural change needed. There's also investment in infrastructure, because I think we have to change this culture of when you're at your desk, you're therefore performing, which is not the case in Iceland, in Norway, in a lot of Nordic countries. It's about output, it's not where you are. It's not about being seen at your place of work. So culturally, that I think is something that can change as well. And actually, touching on Iceland, they are the first country to actually outlaw. They're bringing in legislation, which is a phenomenal move to say that this legislation will end gender inequality in pay. I've looked at the act. It's very simple but very effective, because they've said we've given companies long enough. You haven't done it, so we'll bring in legislation. So I think there's a lot that will change this year. The other thing, lastly, I'll say on that is that I don't like this idea of some of the rhetoric around this, because it's about equality across the genders. It doesn't matter who you are, and because I don't like this idea that suddenly women become above men. I really don't like this idea. He for she is a fantastic movement. It's about equality for everyone, not just for women.
Very quick one, Cindy. I mean, I don't know if the FT knows it's going to be 100 years till anything happens. I mean, I'm amazed, and I don't say it's only about the FT. I would say happily about the Economist. I'm amazed if we know what's happening the year after next. So I think that it's all such a long haul can be a bit of a displacement activity to what can we change quickly. I think you're very interesting. You picked up on millennials. I think what's something that it is changing very fast is that millennials are often thought, I'm going to write my retirement sort of comedy script. It's going to be called Midlifers versus Millennials, because it really is going through that sort of difference in the way that your two bits of your workforce work together, sometimes don't work together, are often about that. On the downside, I think some people find millennials entitled or sort of exuding an entitlement. The upside of that is they don't think everything should be a fight. And I think a lot of us, sort of women and other minorities in workforces, even coming in the 80s, the 90s, sort of still thought you were in some sort of embattled sort of group, had to fight your way up through a corporate culture. I think they expect corporate culture, as Gina rightly points out, to be supportive and to allow them to fulfill potential. If they don't like it, they would be prepared to leave. And I think that's something that that companies are beginning to get their heads around. Just one point about the again, funny enough, we touched on the way in, Simon, is the difference between pipelines and boards. I feel we've had too much focus on boards and board level, and queen bees are not the same as a happy hive, and this is really where we're going to have to spread very aggressively, kind of go out there in our companies, in our workplace, and say, what is it like in the middle? Often you find people are nice to the new recruits and they're nice to the high flyers. A middle, you know. It's the middle. As a friend of mine said, you know, don't worry, it's not so tough at the top, it was tough in the middle.
George, any thoughts?
Well, apart from agreeing with all that, I mean, we've gone through it ourselves. I mean, my wife is a working mum, and she's worked for a couple of companies, and it just shows how important it is just to get that offer right, to allow people to work at home, and just to say, well, you don't need to, as you were saying, you don't need to be in front of your office desk all day as long as you get the work done. If you can do it from home, she's actually working from home at the moment with our little boy who's a bit sick today, so but she can do so, which is very good.
Very good. It's 9:30, I'm afraid, so we'll have to draw to a close. I think, it's a good note to close on. I mean, in summary, Gina, you feel that there's sort of a lot of legal challenges we should expect in 2018 on the Brexit side, and you talked about the global politics and gender, and George, I think basically optimistic about the economy both domestically and globally. Well, we'll have you back in 12 months. And see how we did. Thank you very much, the three of you. It's been a great pleasure, and thank you to all of you for coming.